Hotep, my brothers and sisters, I greet you in the African tradition of Hotep, which means peace. Welcome to another edition of Perspectives in Religion. My name is Wayne Purcell, and again, I want to thank you for allowing us to tell our story. Last week we talked about the various translations of the Bible and how over centuries of time translations can be jumbled up, mixed up, confused, corrupted, and certain translations can also be used to demonize the originators over the course of time. And one of the things I attempted to talk about the story of Asar, Aset, and Heru, who were the ancient god and goddesses of ancient Kemet, and how through the system of spirituality that the myth of the gods and goddesses leads one to spiritual enlightenment. But you have to understand how the myths were portrayed in the ancient time. And so one of the stories, as I attempted to do last week, but I didn't have enough information to really be thorough, I want to, as I said, share with you that story so that perhaps you can get a feel as to how the story develops and what it projects as it relates to spirituality. And so I'm going to attempt to share that story with you. We have seen how the divine self in the form of Ra created the world and all living creatures. Also, we have seen how the goddess in the form of Hetheru was called upon by Ra to punish unrighteous people. Ra later decided that there should be a divine incarnation of himself. The teaching about the divine incarnation exists in all parts of the world. Some examples of it are Jesus, Krishna, Buddha, and others. Ra decreed that the world needed someone to lead it, to teach it the proper way to live, the way which leads to blessedness and spiritual enlightenment. For this purpose, Asar, who is also called Osiris in the Greek name, and Aset, who is also called Isis in the Greek name, who had come into existence when Ra emerged from the primeval ocean and creation came into being, now came into the world and assumed the rulership of Egypt and brought civilization to the world. Here begins the story of Asar, Aset, and Heru. Asar and Aset dedicated themselves to the welfare of humanity and sought to spread civilization throughout the earth, even as far as India and China. The goddess Aset sought for higher wisdom and power in order to rule over the world in a better way, and also to help her son Heru face his struggles and challenges in life. She began to meditate on this noble desire. This was the beginning of the first story within the myth of Asar, Aset, and Heru. Asar and Aset has been sent into the world by Ra to rule and show men and women the path to righteousness and spiritual enlightenment. One time, Asar went on a tour around the world to talk and teach people outside of Egypt. He went to Nubia, India, and what is today called Europe. Aset continued to rule over Egypt while Asar was traveling around the world. During the absence of Asar from his kingdom, his brother Set had no opportunity to make innovations in the state, because Aset was extremely vigilant in governing the country and always upon her guard and watchful for any irregularities or unrighteousness. Upon Asar's return from touring the world and carrying the teachings of wisdom abroad, there was merriment and rejoicing throughout the land. However, one day, after Asar's return, through his lack of vigilance, he became intoxicated and slept with Set's wife, Nebset. Nebset loved Asar and seized the opportunity to sleep with Asar at a time when he was not vigilant. Since she looks just like Aset, which is her sister, except for her headdress, Nebset, as a result of the union with Asar, begot Anpu. Set, who represents the personification of evil forces, plotted in jealousy and anger, the blinding passion that prevents forgiveness and understanding, to usurp the throne and conspire to kill Asar. Set secretly got the measurements of Asar and constructed a coffin. Through trickery, Set was able to get Asar to try on the coffin for size. While Asar was resting in the coffin, Set and his assistants locked it and then dumped it into the Nile River. The coffin made its way to the coast of Syria, where it became embedded in the earth, and from it grew a tree with the most pleasant aroma in the form of a djed. The djed is the symbol of Asar's back. It has 4 horizontal lines in relation to a firmly established straight line. The djed column is symbolic of the upper energy centers called chakras that relate to the levels of consciousness of the spirit. The king of Syria was out walking. As he passed by the tree, he immediately fell in love with the pleasant aroma. So he had the tree cut down and brought to his palace. Aset, Asar's wife, who is the personification of the life-giving mother force in creation and in all humans, went to Syria in search of Asar. Her search led her to the palace of the Syrian king, where she took a job as the nurse of the king's son. Every evening, Aset would put the boy into the fire to consume his mortal parts, thereby transforming him to immortality. Fire is symbolic of both physical and mental purification. Most importantly, fire implies wisdom, the light of truth, illumination, and energy which burns away ignorance and egoism. Aset, by virtue of her qualities, has the power to bestow immortality through the transformative power of her symbolic essence. She symbolizes intuitional wisdom, which leads to the eradication of mortal consciousness and the birth of immortal consciousness. Aset then told the king that Asar, her husband, was inside the pillar he made from the tree. He graciously gave her the pillar, which we call the djed, and she returned with it to Kemet. With the assistance of the crocodile god called Sobek, Aset brought the body of Asar back to Kemet. Upon her return to Kemet, Aset went to the papyrus swamps, where she lay over Asar's dead body and fanned him with her wings, infusing him with new life. In this manner, Aset revived Asar through her power of love and wisdom, and then they united once more. From their union was conceived a son named Heru, or Horus as they call it in Greek, with the assistance of the gods, Dishahuti and Ammon. Heru, therefore, was born from the union of the spirit of Asar and the life-giving power of Aset, which is the physical nature. Thus, Heru represents the union of the spirit and matter, and the renewed life of Asar, his rebirth. Asar represents the human soul, which has incarnated on earth in human form. Thus, he represents the innermost reality of all human beings. Life and the physical human existence fall in love with the soul, which is symbolized by Nebset, love for Asar. Nebset represents physical pleasure. When the soul forgets its true nature, it becomes overpowered by the lower nature, which is the ego, as symbolized by the brother Set. Therefore, Asar's brother, Set, symbolizes egoism and all of the negative qualities which a human being can develop when they are ignorant of their higher essence. The story symbolically relates how the unbridled negative emotions and desires of a human being, which is the ego, essentially hacks the soul to pieces and attempts to stop any chance for it to reincarnate in order to seek redemption and enlightenment. Set also represents the treachery of the world, that which seems to be a promise of pleasure, but is in reality a snare which enslaves the soul to the myriad forms of misery of human existence. Set also represents the distractions and pressure of life to indulge in the pleasures of the senses. Thus, Heru which is the son of Asar and Aset, represents spiritual aspiration, the desire to study and practice the teachings and the inner spiritual strength which is required to sublimate the ego and to succeed in the struggle of life. Aset is the wisdom which allows a person to put together the understanding of their higher reality, which is the spirit. She is also the knowledge of how to call to the divine in order to discover one's true spiritual essence. She, together with the inner spirit, as symbolized by the spirit of Asar, is also the power within the heart which gives a person encouragement and strength to face the adversaries of the world, and then to call out to the divine in order to attain enlightenment. So, when a desire to learn spirituality emerges, it is the spirit of Asar which is urging the spirit onward. Then that movement towards spirituality is nurtured by the goddess as a mother who brings forth new life and nourishes it to health and growth by protecting it from the elements and from all negative influence until it is strong enough to stand on its own. Apot, which is the offspring from Asar and his illicit affair with Nebuchadnezzar, Apot represents the development of intellectual discrimination, the ability to understand truth from untruth, reality from unreality. And Sobek represents the power of the lower nature, the physical body, when it is sublimated and placed in the service of the higher self. Now, we can get more into this as time goes on, but the story of the Asarian resurrection deals with the nature and the worldly consciousness and death. So, you have Nebuchadnezzar, who is the sister of Asar, and Aset, and the consort of Set. She represents the gross aspect of nature and the natural phase of life called decay and death. Nature is what the spirit impregnates with its life-giving essence. According to natural law, anything that is born must be subject to the laws of nature and ultimately die. In the epic story of the Asarian resurrection, Asar, original form, was detached from nature. Asar was timeless, immortal, and untouched by the passions and frailties of human nature as the spirit of Ra. As an incarnation of the divine, Ra, we have Asar, who became intoxicated with nature, his own creation, and became associated with it through intercourse with Nebuchadnezzar. Asar, as a symbol of the human soul, is a stark example of the fate of human existence. His situation embodies the predicament of every individual human being. This is why the ancient Egyptian pharaohs and all initiated into the mystery of Asar are referred to as Asar and or Heru, and are considered to be the husband or daughter or son, respectively, of Aset. Just as Asar became intoxicated with his own creation, so too the human soul becomes involved with nature and thereby produces a physical body composed of an aggregate of gross physical elements, which are water, earth, fire, and air. The union between Asar, which the soul, divine self, and Nebuchadnezzar, which was the physical gross nature, begets Ampwat, or Ampu, who represents spiritual aspiration and devotion. When the soul evolves, it communes with higher nature in the form of Aset. The union between Asar, which is the soul, and Aset, the wisdom or the subtle nature, begets Horus, or Heru, the higher self, which stands for enlightenment. Therefore, nature is the recipient of Asar's seed, which is the spirit. This deep mystical symbolism in the images and teachings surrounding the triad of Asar, Aset, and Neset in the temples of Dendera, Edfu, and Philae, there are sculptured representations of the mysteries of Asar. These show the Asar, which the initiate, lying on a briar, which is the ritual bed, and Aset and Neset, who stand nearby, being referred to as the two widows of the dead Asar. These images, from the basis of the Ushat Rakat ritual, Set and Nephset are depicted as looking exactly alike, the only difference being in the headdress. Set, Nephset, however, the symbols of these goddesses are in reality just inverted images of each other. The symbol of Set is the symbol of Nephset when inverted. Therefore, each is a reflection of the other. Thus, it can be said that both life and death are aspects of the same principle. Amen. As we continue on, I wanted to share that story with you because that is part of how the mystery of the images, and when we in the Western world see the images, we relate them to charlatanism and demonizing the culture by, they expressing all of these crazy things. But Dionysus the Areopagite, sometime in BC, made a statement, and I'm going to read the quote that he makes as it relates to the images that were projected throughout Egypt. He says, "If anyone suggests that it is disgraceful to fashion base images of the divine and most holy orders, it is sufficient to answer that the most holy mysteries are set forth in two modes, one by means of similar and sacred representations akin to the nature, and the other to unlike forms designed with every possible discordance. Discordant symbols are more appropriate representations of the divine because the human mind tends to cling to the physical form of representation, believing, for example, that the divine are golden beings or shining men flashing like lightning. But lest this error befall us, the wisdom of the venerable sages leads us through disharmonious dissimilitudes, not allowing our irrational nature to become attached to those unseemly images. Divine things may not be easily accessible to the unworthy, nor may those who earnestly contemplate the divine symbols dwell upon the forms themselves as final truth." In other words, what he's saying is that it is better to project God in the type of images that our mind cannot conceive of, because we then will not fall for the physical nature of those things and thereby worshiping those images. Whereas when we make God to look like a certain image, or whatever that image might be, then we cling to that because we associate that with something else. As an example, if we make Jesus into a white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired male, then we tend to cling to that as being pure, as being symbolic of righteousness, that which looks like Jesus. And so what he is saying is that those images are wrong. And so when we talk about the images that comes out of Egypt, we need to check ourselves, because the wisdom in that is far greater than what we have been told. And when you look at it from a literal perspective, what you get is a demonization of something that offers us a very great spiritual truth of which to live by. And so I share that with you so that we might be aware of that. Let us not be fooled by the images and the names that we recognize, that we hear when I share with you the ancient symbolisms of ancient Egypt. Another quote by Plutarch, who was around 46-120 ACE, was a very popular philosopher in Greek. He says, "When therefore thou hearest the myths of the Egyptians concerning the gods, wanderings and dismemberings, and many such passions, think none of these things spoken as they really are in state and action, for they do not call Hermes dog as a proper name, but they associate the watching and walking from sleep of the animal, who by knowing and not knowing determines friend from foe with the most logos, like of the gods." So in other words, that even though they may show a God as a picture, which Hermes in this case, Hermes in the Greek is a dog, has nothing to do with God, but what it does suggest is that as a dog is able to wake up from his sleep and automatically discerned right from wrong because of the instincts of the dog, that relates to how God can discern and know things just rising up from slumber. So they attribute the attributes of the animal. The lion, the attributes of the lion is that the lion is the king of beasts, and the mane that goes around the neck is symbolic of the power of the lion. And so it has nothing to do with God being a lion, but it has those attributes of the lion. And that's what I've been trying to say all along when we talk about the gods and goddesses, that we're not supposed to take them literal. We're just supposed to recognize that in the creation of things, that the gods and goddesses are nothing more than manifestations of the one true God, which is Amun, Asar. There's a prayer that says Padnatur Uu Nebeja Neteru. And what it suggests is that there's only one God that acts as the manifestations of all things. And so the one God that we see, and when we call the rain or the water, which is Nu, the Nun is the sky, Shu is the air, those are simply manifestations. And we have to understand how the ancients thought. And when I share things with you, and we're talking about over 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, certainly it's hard for us to discern those things because we don't think like that. I mean, none of us do. We're thinking, the way we should think as far as 2007 is concerned. But those stories are symbolic of how a person can get online with understanding their spiritual self, the physical self, our passions, our lust, our sinful nature, as well as our spiritual nature. And so when we see Heru as the offspring of Asar and Set, and Set the brother of Asar, then we look at those, and the literal aspect shares with us, two individuals. But the symbolism of them is that Heru is in reality our spiritual self, our higher self, and Set is in reality our lower self. And so when Set attempts to kill his brother Asar, what that suggests is that the ego of a Set, that's our lower self, the hatred, the envy, the jealousy, the wanting to have what someone else has, the lustful natures, that sometimes overrules the higher self, which is the spiritual person, and when it does, it commits acts of gross injustices that we saw with Set. Then Heru, on the other hand, is that spiritual aspect of ourselves that when we are in proper order, the spiritual part of man leads the lower self. And so they come together. And we must recognize that we have both, human and divinity, or flesh and spirit. And we will always be that. But the key to life and overcoming the struggles of life is to never allow the lower self to overcome the higher self, but to keep the lower self in submission and subjected unto the higher self, whereby our passions are never out of control. We're always in control over our passions and the intellect. This is what the stories are symbolic of. This is symbolic of the story of Asar, Set, and Heru, and the reincarnation of Asar, who is dead and reincarnated. And then when he is reincarnated, and it talks about Asar and Set coming together, well, when they come together, they form what is called the Immaculate Conception. And in the Immaculate Conception, what we have is Heru. Heru is nothing more than the the immaculate conception of the two. And Heru then champions the cause of Asar. And then that's where I left last week, and I wanted this week to share with you some of what comes out of that story, so that we don't take it literally when you hear. And it's very difficult when we talk about gods and goddesses, and I haven't really even talked about the forms of the various gods and goddesses that they made the statues of, because the foreigners who went over there saw that and said, oh, they're worshiping animals, and that's not it. That was not it at all. We have to really understand Egyptian theology and the wisdom of it, and how that the nation, what they did, stood for over, several thousand years at a high culture. No civilization has lasted as long as ancient Egypt. None on record today. And so that should suggest something to you and I, that if we're talking about a culture that lasted longer than any culture on earth put together, how can we actually have the nerve to allow somebody to denigrate Egypt and Africa when the proof is there? Now, the other countries, in fact, our history comes through the three components that, had it not been for Africa, they would not even have a history. That is, first of all, the Hebrews. So history comes through the Hebraic method, it comes through Rome, and then it comes through Greece. Those three. Now, the Hebrews, we know, before Moses, they didn't even have record of anything before Moses came on the scene. So if that's the case, then their history starts with Moses. Well, Moses would not even exist had it not been for Egypt, who brought him into their fold and nurtured him and taught him everything he knew. And so the only reason why he was able to write was his time in Egypt. And the only thing when he recognized the spirituality of man and he started out on his own, he was able to transpose what he learned in Egypt and give to the people what he wanted them to have. And he taught them in a way that they might understand it better. He couldn't teach them like the Egyptians taught the Egypts, because the Egyptians knew and understood and recognized what about the gods and goddesses. And so Moses had to teach them like babes. So whereas you had the 42 laws of Ma'at, Moses was breaking down to the 10 laws of Moses, which was the 10 commandments. He made them so simple. Thou shalt not, and that sort of thing. And the Greeks, everything that comes out of Egypt, the Greeks stole just about. When you look at all of the gods of the Greeks, just to give you an example, Amun, who was one of the major deities of ancient Egypt, Greek stole that and just changed the name and called him Zeus. Ra, who is the supreme god, Greek stole that and called it Helios. And some of the names that you might have heard before in Greek, such as Consul, which is in the Egyptian name of one of the gods, well, they called it Heracles in Greece. And we used to go to movies to watch Hercules, or Heracles, we called it Hercules. And some of the other names of Asar, they called it Osiris. Set, they called it Isis. They also called Asar Dionysus. And Imhotep, who was one of the greatest doctors there was, he was so great they deified him. Well, the Greeks took that and named their god Asclepius. And so, and you still see that symbol on the pharmaceutical stores now, where the serpents crawl up the jid, and so that comes out of Egypt. These people wrote their history. And Rome, well, Rome, hey, they couldn't even last. All they were about was plundering, stealing, murdering, pillaging. And they didn't have, and because they couldn't compete with Egypt, they went ahead on and made Christianity the chosen religion. And when that happened, then they allowed Christianity to go stamp out the Egyptian religion. But Egypt was the eighth wonder of the world. And so those three nations that we get our history from, they were supported, taught, and raised by ancient Kemet. And so I thank you for your time. My time is up. You've been listening to Spirit, my. You've been listening to Perspectives in Religion. My name is Wayne Purcell, and I thank you for allowing me to share our story.